Hello internet people. Great way to start a video. Anyway, I am recording this video today because last time I recorded, someone mentioned that this would be an interesting topic for a future YouTube video, which is that I mentioned that I don't have a visual imagination or an internal monologue. And it came up again today, and I thought that's as good a sign as any that I should record something today. So I'm going to talk about what the inside of my brain is like today, and maybe it will help people who aren't like this make a little bit of sense of it. Because it seems to be very, very difficult for people who are visual and have an internal monologue to understand. To be clear, obviously I have thoughts inside my mind. I sometimes wonder, internal monologue, when people are using that, do they just mean they think to themselves, or is there actually a voice inside their head that is them talking back to themselves as feedback about their decisions? I'm not sure. Maybe if you have an internal monologue that you really strongly define as an internal monologue, you could explain it to me, because when you don't have one, I think it's just as hard to understand what it's like as it is for someone who does have one to understand what it's like for me not to have one. For example, when I was younger, I never really thought about it because I guess I wasn't spending time with people who would just sit down and describe what it was like to think about things a lot. And even when I joined a philosophy group in late high school, it wasn't as if we'd sit down and discuss how we thought about things. We would discuss the philosophy of living a good life and the basics of philosophy. Maybe if I had taken it into higher education, then we would have got more into that. But I never really figured that I wasn't the same as everyone else. There were sometimes things that felt unusually pointless to me, if that makes sense. Like, for example, any kind of visualization technique in meditation or yoga, or I went to a dialectic behavioral therapy group for some time in my mental health treatment, which is a topic for another video. And I remember there's one particular visualization they were asking us to do, which was to imagine that your mind is a stream and your thoughts are dropping onto these leaves and the stream is carrying them away. Speaking of leaves dropping, there's a bit of wind out there right now, sorry about that. And as I was doing it, and this would happen to me a lot with visualization techniques in terms of meditation, I was just thinking to myself, it's such a lot of work to visualize this concept. It just makes me feel a bit more frustrated than it does make me feel calm or relaxed or anything of the sort. But I didn't think to ask if anyone else was finding it frustrating. The moment that I discovered that other people were visually seeing things when they closed their eyes was on the phone to a friend one day, and she was talking about her imagination and her memory of something, and she remembered exactly what I had been wearing on a particular day. And I was like, wow, you have an incredible memory. How do you remember that? How do you remember what I was wearing and what that other person was wearing? And she was like, oh, once there's an image in my mind, if I close my eyes and think of the memory, the whole thing just flashes back up for me. It's like a really detailed photograph. And I was like, what do you mean by that? Like what do you mean the image flashes up and you can... Because she was saying, I don't remember that you were wearing it. I have the memory, and when I close my eyes and see the memory, I can see what you were wearing. And that concept baffled me. Obviously, her memory was very good. I don't think everyone sees things that way. But I was saying, what do you mean you see things when you close your eyes? And she was like, what do you mean you don't see things? And I was like, well, I thought that was just in movies to kind of make it easier for the audience to understand what someone is thinking and remembering. And I thought when we were saying like a mental image or a picture this in your mind, that it was just kind of like a way of expressing something, but it wasn't actually a picture. She was saying, well, what do you see when you close your eyes and think about things? And I said, well, I don't see anything, obviously, because my eyes are closed. And that's when I realized that was not the same for everyone else. And from that, I started learning a little bit more about visual imagination versus non-visual imagination, and internal monologue versus whatever is going on in my brain. And yeah, I realized what I'm not seeing is really different to other people's experience. And kind of then, obviously, the more I would talk about it to people, the more I realized that everybody actually had a very different experience of visual imagination also, because for some people, for example, someone I knew's mother, hers was so strong that when she imagined things or pictured scenarios in her mind, she could have her eyes open and she would see that scenario playing out, overlaid over the top of reality. And surprise, surprise, she was a fantastic businesswoman and negotiator, because she would imagine the way she would proceed with a scenario and could see the eventualities playing out in reality. And I just thought that was fascinating. And so I kind of figured, oh wow, we're all seeing really different things, or not seeing them, so to speak. Someone else that I knew, and this is kind of like what my non-visual imagination is, his was very logical. It was almost as if he had this catalog of concepts that his brain would pull from. Mine feels like this, but maybe a little bit less regimented. It's like someone says a green apple, and you just know what an apple looks like. You know what the color green looks like. Those concepts meld together in your mind, and without seeing it, you just know what that looks like. Maybe if I didn't see an apple for really, really long time, then I wouldn't remember it in the same way other people do. But I have quite a good memory. But a lot of the time, I'm not remembering the visuals of a scenario. I'm sort of remembering where things were in relation to other things in a much more word-based kind of conceptualization. It's difficult to explain, I guess, because it's just how my mind works. And I think my non-internal internal monologue also plays into this, because when I'm thinking about things, when I'm imagining things, when I'm remembering things, there are thoughts in my mind, but a lot of the time it's more like they're ideas. They're not voices, they're not images, they're just ideas and kind of different strings of consciousness that cycle through, and I'm picking little pieces out of them, and then that sort of branches out into a new concept, kind of like, and it's very difficult to explain to people how I got from one idea to the next sometimes, because in my mind, it was just how the ideas logically progressed. And I can trace backwards often, but I think that the progression is a lot less linear than it seems to be if there is a voice internally conversing about the ideas before they come out. Again, I don't know what it's like to have an internal dialogue, an internal monologue, I suppose. I guess an internal dialogue is a whole different thing. But for example, if I think a thought, I can make the voice in my head say it out loud, but it's following along with the thought, which occurs non-verbally, and that voice is never speaking, not independently, but I'm just commanding it to think things in a verbal manner. The same for imagination and visual imagery. Occasionally I have flashes of an internal image. There's a test that you can do where you imagine a red star with a black outline, and there's sort of like these pictures of what are you seeing. For some people they'll see like this very sort of blurry outline. For some people they see this bright red star with a really defined border. And for other people they see nothing. But it's not like you can't conceptualize what that star looks like. You're just not seeing it visually. For me, it's very, very faint and blurry. And sometimes I have a visual in my mind that will suddenly flash into focus. And it's kind of surprising to me. And it always feels like it hangs around for a bit. Like I'm like, wow, that was so striking. But when I'm imagining a red star with a black outline, it's like, well, I don't need to see it. You just said red star with a black outline and I know what that would look like. It doesn't come up as an image, but I just know what it would look like. The same as there's no voice inside my head that says what I'm thinking, and I go backwards and forwards and kind of have this circular kind of like, oh, should I not, should I just know. The other thing that really strikes me about this whole conversation is a lot of people think you're an NPC if you don't have an internal dialogue, internal monologue. I keep saying dialogue, but I think that means that you have other voices talking, which is, I gather, somewhat different. If you don't have an internal monologue, they think, oh wow, these people are out there just motoring around like automatons. And it's not at all like that. I feel like there's actually a lot, I'm not going to say a lot more, but it's just a really different way of processing information. Like for me, I can be having multiple different lines of thought overlaid over the top of one another. And I think that that often makes it much easier to understand certain concepts, because the processing can be kind of happening with multi-layers, but you're almost looking from the top down and seeing how things intersect a little bit more. So I've always found the idea that we're just brainless or have no thoughts to be very interesting. Firstly, because, well, obviously no one is really like that. Secondly, because I feel like it's actually very telling about your own lack of imagination that you can't even imagine how someone could be having thoughts outside of the confines that you have thoughts. I've always felt like it betrays a bit of a lack of, I'm not going to say intelligence, but a bit of a lack of, what's the word that I'm looking for here? You're not able to see outside of your own experience and realize that other people are actually experiencing the same world as you in a completely different way. Your way of experiencing things and imagining things and thinking about things is by far not the only valid way of understanding the world. It's kind of like people who can't even imagine that anyone would operate in the world with a different set of logical principles or moral principles. To me, even if I don't agree with something, it always feels very obvious to me that people could be experiencing things very differently to how I'm experiencing them, because even before I realized this was part of the difference, the way that I interacted with the world and the conclusions that I drew from certain actions or certain situations felt very different from other people's. And I didn't automatically assume that mine were the only logical ways. Usually, in fact, I thought, I'm just such a weirdo, I will never ever fit into this world. But it always felt quite obvious that everybody's internal experience would be quite different to mine. So when I found out that other people were having this very visual experience of their imagination, or hearing their own voice debating over the decisions they were going to make, I thought, oh wow, that's really different. But it wasn't like it baffled me. I just sort of adapted that into my understanding of the world. And yeah, that is kind of how things work in my mind. I make a reasonable amount of art. I storyboard videos and movies that I've made. It's not like I'm just a particularly logical person either. I've heard that as something that people assume about being non-visually imaginative, is that you have a very kind of cold, logical processing outlook on the world. To me, it kind of couldn't be any further from the truth. I feel like my emotional processing is so much more powerful than even my internal verbal processing. So much so that a lot of the time there are all of these concepts that feel like they're existing in this realm that I am constantly trying to figure out how to express out into the world. So creating art is apparently going to be quite a different experience for me versus someone who can think of an idea and then, while they have that image in their mind, start creating it. Often I will start an artwork and it ends up turning into something very, very different to perhaps, I keep using the word visualize because I don't really know what other word there is. Even though it's not visual, it's still my understanding of visualizing something. But yeah, we are out here and we are generally not NPCs, and we have a alive and exciting inner world in our minds that just expresses really differently to how yours expresses if you are more visual. And I think if you are a therapist or a yoga teacher or even just a regular teacher, understanding that some people are non-visual is actually really important, because I always found it very difficult to follow meditations that heavily involved picturing concepts, because for me to picture something, it's like I'm constantly having to re-pull that data for every different frame of the visualization almost. So I'm kind of marshalling all of these different concepts from my brain into the one place. And there are other far more calming or relaxing ways of meditating and calming oneself, I suppose, that work a lot better for me. So, if you're talking to someone or running them through a meditation and they seem to be becoming more overwhelmed by the visualization you're giving them, maybe they're a non-visual imaginer, which is called aphantasia, if you don't know that. Maybe I should have said that somewhere earlier in this video. But I think for all these reasons, it does result in me communicating in what feels like a fairly different way to some other people. My mind can skip from one idea more in a more jumpy way than other people seems to. And I think that's because with the lack of an internal monologue, while I'm talking out loud, I don't need to give any space to the internal monologue. The whole time I am talking about something, my internal processing is going at exactly the same speed that it was, and none of it is being outsourced to my actual voice. So often I'll make a leap to a different point in the conversation, and it feels quite logical for me to have jumped there, but I'll sort of have to go backwards and reprocess a few steps verbally. I think I'm kind of assuming that my processing is just easily interpreted, because processing is something that doesn't need to be verbalized in my brain. That's definitely a failing on my part. That's not me saying other people just aren't quick enough with their processing. I think it's because I don't talk to a lot of people in real life. And so, in my mind, I'm like, oh, well, we're all kind of just hearing something, and then it's overlaying with all of the other concepts that we've been talking about for the last week. Like I said, it's kind of like you have all of these concepts and thoughts that are overlaying one another, and you're almost looking at them from different perspectives, and they're kind of interlocking with one another, and the processing takes into account each layer or multiple layers, or each of the layers with a particular slice of the information almost. In terms of imagination, I feel like it's kind of similar. When people will ask me to find something in a really messy room, it's not like I just know where everything is. But if I saw something in your room that you later ask me, where is that thing? In my mind, it's always kind of operating in the sense of, oh, that thing was next to this empty box, which was right underneath this jacket. And like, that's kind of how my brain is picking ideas out. And that's kind of how my brain is conceptualizing the things that I'm trying to imagine. It's, oh, well, an apple, and then the color green, and then a tree, and then it's so hard to explain. I feel like explaining something in a way that it makes visual sense, or that someone can imagine it, it kind of goes against the whole idea of your imagination being non-visual. But I have tried my best to explain what it is like, and to kind of get some of that information out there. There are some things that it is really hard to remember, like, I don't think I could just draw a person's face from memory, even if I would know them if I saw them. The information is in there, I just can't visually generate it in that way. I find it quite difficult to keep things in my mind that are not being visually represented in my real world. I find it quite difficult to emotionally connect with people that I don't interact with physically, or not even necessarily physically, but on an ongoing basis. Obviously, if a friendship breaks down, I am very upset about it in that moment, and often it sticks with me for a really long time because, like I said, I'm quite an emotional person. But simply drifting away from someone and kind of no longer getting daily messages from them or talking to them, that kind of thing, I think I'm sort of much more likely to just go, oh, okay, that thing is no longer a part of my reality. And I think I'm able to move past friendships drifting once things feel like they're drifting. I think for me, it's probably a lot easier to just embrace that drift, because I think trying to keep all of these things in my mind when they have to be kept there in a very different sense, maybe it feels a little bit more exhausting. I've always found it really difficult to maintain a lot of different friendships, and I do wonder whether that's because of the difference in the way I process information. It doesn't just feel simple to have all of these different interactions with lots of different people going on at once. And again, that might be something entirely different, but it feels a little bit more, it feels somehow related to this. I'm getting a little sidetracked here. But yeah, those are the ways where I feel like maybe it's a little more difficult. A lot of people think that if you don't have an internal monologue, you will just not be anxious, or you won't overthink things. That, in my experience, is not at all the case. I default to writing a lot of things down and journaling a huge amount, which I think is my way of trying to turn the swirling maelstrom of concepts and feelings and thoughts in my mind. Because concepts, feelings, thoughts, my ideas about how things should be, all of them feel the same in my mind. There's not a voice in there cataloging them and discussing them. I have to write that out or speak it out loud to actually have it feel like it's been passed in a way that can be made more sense of. I think a lot of the time I feel like it is very difficult to make sense of my brain in the individual moments, because it just feels like there's so much going on and it can be so overwhelming. And then at other times when you feel depressed, it feels very bleak and lonely, and it's kind of just like all of these echoing concepts of self-hatred sort of rattling around in this dark, silent space. And that feels quite isolating. So yeah, there's definitely not just this freedom from overthinking that you get when you are non-visual. So I just want to put that out there for people. It's not like not having an internal monologue is just, oh, so healthy, your brain must just kind of work. I've had a long history of my brain not really working, even though I think it works pretty well, and I just needed to embrace its differences. I am definitely still a dweller and an overthinker, and can get trapped in my own fear of how situations will turn out. But yeah, that's kind of the best way that I can explain how my mind works. I don't think I'm an NPC. A lot of people say that. It's kind of like, oh my gosh, just these stupid people without any thoughts in their brain. And again, I just want to say, don't you think that it's quite narrow-minded to think that people can only think in the way that you do? I just would love people to examine that concept a little more. The idea that anyone in the out group must just not have as much going on, and your in group has a special insight into this out group that they could never hope to have towards you. Yeah, that's my ramble about aphantasia and having a fairly silent brain. Sometimes it's kind of peaceful, I'm not gonna lie. I think maybe that's why I often don't mind not listening to any music when I'm sitting around the house, because it's just kind of nice to just chill and wait for thoughts to surface and turn them over. The funny thing is, I have very visual dreams. In dreams, I'm definitely seeing images, and they just don't come to me in my active, awake imagination. So yeah, that's how it works for me. I'm sure it's different for other people who have aphantasia. I think there's varying degrees of aphantasia, so there's probably varying degrees of the internal monologue spectrum. I would say that having an internal monologue is probably actually right about in the middle of the spectrum. And for some people, they have a whole internal dialogue going on with multiple players outside of themselves. And then on the other end of the spectrum, which I'm a little closer to, is the swirling thoughts that exist outside of verbal expression. Mine can be expressed verbally, but it's not the primary way that they emerge. I'm sure that there's people on the very far spectrum who have entirely non-verbal internal concepts, and I find that fascinating too. But yeah, that's how my brain works, or at least the best I can approximate it and describe it for you. So thanks for listening. I hope you found it kinda interesting, or at the very least that it helped you see that people who don't have internal monologues have just as much going on internally. It doesn't have a voice. It's like telepathy. If the thing that you were communicating with telepathically didn't speak a language. You know, that's actually, I should have explained it like this at the very beginning maybe. If something was communicating with you and neither of you had a common language, but this thing is beaming information into your brain, that's kind of how it feels. It's the concepts of things. You don't know how you understand it, you just do. Does that make any sense? Is that clearer, or is that far less clear? Anyway, thank you for listening. Appreciate you. Remember to drink some water and take a little walk today. It's good for you.